Ladies and gentlemen, in a world driven by superficial success, where fame overshadows wisdom and shortcuts replace discipline, we face a crisis. The undervaluing of education, not just in schools, but in life. This talk is not about textbooks or grades. It's about the kind of education that liberates your mind, shapes your soul, and transforms your reality. Today we address a deep question. Why do so many people fail to thrive despite all the tools at their fingertips? And the answer is hidden in the kind of learning we've ignored. Education is often mistaken for something confined within four walls, ruled by bells and schedules, handed out in degrees and diplomas. But what the world rarely tells you is that real education begins the moment the classroom doors close, the moment the structure fades away, and you're left standing with only your curiosity, your questions, and the whispering voice inside you that wants to understand life, not just memorize it. So, notwithstanding all effort, schools teach us how to follow directions, how to remember data, how to pass tests. But life doesn't operate by curriculums. Life tests you first and teaches you after. And in that way, the true education starts when you begin asking the kind of questions that can't be answered in a textbook. Who am I? Why am I here? What does it mean to live fully? How do I turn my pain into purpose? These are not standardized test questions. They are soul questions, and answering them is the beginning of your real education. When the world tells you to get a job, follow a path, stay inside the box, the truly educated mind asks, is this path mine, or was it given to me without my permission? That kind of questioning is a sign you are waking up. You start realizing that education is not about collecting facts, it's about becoming aware. It's not about being told what to think, it's about learning how to think. You move from absorbing information to developing insight. You move from memorization to realization, from repeating to creating. And that is where growth begins. A person can graduate with honors and still be deeply uneducated about themselves. Because if you don't understand your fears, your patterns, your limiting beliefs, then no matter how many degrees you collect, you are walking through life asleep. Education in its truest form wakes you up. It opens your eyes to your potential, your habits, your emotional wounds, your power. It demands that you listen, not just to experts, but to yourself. It invites you to be still enough to hear your own wisdom. And here's the truth, that kind of education is uncomfortable. It doesn't reward you with trophies. It doesn't come with applause. It comes when you're willing to confront what's been hidden. It comes in quiet moments when you're alone with your thoughts. It comes when you're brave enough to unlearn what no longer serves you. Real education requires you to dismantle old beliefs, question old assumptions, and sometimes walk away from what's familiar. And it doesn't happen in one semester or even 1 year. It's lifelong. When you understand that life itself is the teacher, you begin to treat every moment differently. Failures are no longer setbacks, they are syllabi. Heartbreak isn't just pain, it's a portal. Rejection becomes redirection. Every experience becomes part of your curriculum. Every person you meet teaches you something about love, trust, boundaries, or resilience. You begin to pay attention. You begin to reflect. You begin to see the deeper lesson behind every surface event. That's education. You stop waiting for someone to teach you and start teaching yourself. You go searching, not for answers, but for understanding. You learn from books, not because you have to, but because you're hungry. You listen to people with different perspectives because you want to grow, not because you want to argue. You travel not just to take pictures, but to shift your lens on life. You meditate not to escape reality, but to understand it from within. Everything becomes a classroom, and you are both the student and the subject. This kind of education isn't linear, it's not graded, it doesn't end with a diploma, but it changes you, it evolves you. It makes you less reactive, more present, less judgmental, more compassionate, less afraid, more open. And it starts when you realize that school may have taught you how to make a living, but only you can teach yourself how to truly live. There is a hidden cost many people are paying every single day. It's not printed on receipts, it doesn't show up in your bank account, and yet it drains more from your life than any bill ever could. That cost is ignorance, not the kind of ignorance that comes from lack of schooling, but the kind that arises when a person chooses not to seek, not to ask, not to learn. It's the weight carried by those who stop growing, who settle into their limitations, and who believe that what they know now is all there is to know. That ignorance is expensive, and the price is often paid in regret, missed opportunities, broken relationships, unhealed pain, and a life half-lived. The world doesn't teach us this directly, but everywhere you look, the evidence is clear. People lose years of their lives to jobs they hate because they never learned how to recognize their inner gifts. People remain trapped in toxic cycles because they never learned how to understand their emotions or rewrite their patterns. People walk through life bitter, reactive, and closed off because they never learned how to heal. That is the cost of unchosen ignorance. Not the absence of information, but the absence of transformation. And this is where the deeper meaning of education begins to shine through. Knowledge is not just information stored in the mind, it is light that dispels confusion. It is the lens that changes how you see and therefore how you live. The more you learn about yourself, about human nature, about how life actually works, the more liberated you become. You stop being a puppet to your impulses, a victim of your circumstances, a slave to your past. You begin to make decisions not out of fear but from clarity. You stop reacting and start responding. You begin to see patterns where others see problems. You become more conscious, and that is where real freedom lies. Ignorance keeps you small, but it does something worse. It convinces you that your smallness is normal. It convinces you that struggle is inevitable, that suffering is a lifelong companion, that success is for other people, and that peace is a myth. It wraps itself around your thoughts and presents them as truth. It whispers in your ear that this is just the way life is, and without knowledge, without seeking, without waking up, you start to believe it. That belief is a cage, but knowledge is the key. And this kind of knowledge is not limited to academics or careers. It's about knowing your values, your tendencies, your conditioning. It's about understanding how to regulate your emotions, how to communicate truthfully, how to build inner resilience, how to rise when life breaks you. It's about learning how your mind works, how your story formed, how your trauma shaped your choices, and how to return to your power. Every moment you choose to learn, even a small insight, you are freeing yourself from something that once held you back. There's a kind of strength that comes from reading something that suddenly changes your perspective. There's a quiet power in hearing a single sentence that resonates so deeply it unravels years of misunderstanding. There's a sacred energy that enters your life when you discover that you are not who you thought you were, but something far more vast, more capable, more aware. That is the gift of knowledge. It doesn't just expand your mind, it awakens your spirit. And in today's world, where information is more accessible than ever, the barrier is no longer availability. The barrier is willingness. The willingness to grow, the willingness to question what you've always believed, the willingness to admit you don't know it all, the willingness to be wrong so you can become more right. The people who evolve, the ones who rise, the ones who change the trajectory of their lives, they are not the ones who had all the answers. They are the ones who chose not to stay in the dark. Learning must become a daily act of liberation, a conscious rebellion against the inertia of comfort. It's easy to scroll through distractions, to numb yourself with entertainment, to avoid discomfort by staying busy. But all of that comes at a cost. Because what you don't learn, you repeat. What you ignore controls you. What you refuse to understand keeps you stuck. Education isn't a system you leave behind after graduation. It's a personal revolution you carry with you every day. So when you pick up a book, or listen deeply, or reflect instead of react, you are investing in freedom. When you admit you are wrong, or change a belief, or ask a deeper question, you are declaring your independence from ignorance. You are saying, I refuse to be imprisoned by what I haven't learned yet. And that refusal is not weakness, it is wisdom. It is the beginning of mastery. Because once you know better, you live better. Not by chance, but by choice. And that is what makes knowledge the most powerful form of liberation there is. We live in a culture obsessed with physical nourishment, meal plans, supplements, superfoods. Everywhere you look, people are focused on feeding their bodies. We check calories, count grams of protein, worry about sugar intake, and yet we rarely stop to ask ourselves, what are we feeding our minds? What kind of thoughts are we consuming? What kind of ideas are shaping our inner world? Because just like the body, the mind starves when it's neglected. Just like the body, the mind becomes sick when it's fed only junk. And just like the body, the mind thrives when it's given something real, something nourishing, something vital. When we ignore the mind, we begin to drift. We become restless, anxious, easily distracted. We confuse motion with progress. We scroll endlessly, chasing stimulation but not growth. The mind, when left unfed, doesn't sit still. It deteriorates. It begins to feed on comparison, negativity, fear, and illusions. And slowly, without even realizing it, we begin to shrink. Not in size, but in strength, in spirit, in clarity. We find ourselves emotionally malnourished, mentally fatigued, spiritually dehydrated, and yet we continue on, as if this hunger isn't real, as if the soul can survive on crumbs of content. But the mind, when fed with truth, expands. When it's given reflection, challenge, stillness, and wonder, it starts to come alive. It becomes fertile ground for new thoughts, elevated choices, creative breakthroughs. And this isn't about intelligence. This is about nourishment. Because intelligence alone doesn't bring peace. It doesn't bring awareness. It doesn't bring wholeness. What does? A mind that's consciously nurtured, deliberately shaped, and intentionally awakened. Every idea we entertain, every belief we hold, every voice we let in, it all becomes part of our mental diet. If we constantly feed ourselves fear-driven news, shallow conversations, and recycled thinking, we begin to operate from a place of scarcity. We start to believe that the world is dangerous, that people are untrustworthy, that nothing will ever change. But if we feed the mind with elevated thinking, timeless wisdom, and expansive perspectives, our internal world transforms. We begin to see opportunities where others see obstacles. We begin to understand instead of react. We begin to move through life, not just with information, but with insight. There is a version of you that exists beyond your current habits, your current fears, your current limitations. That version is not a fantasy, it's a potential. And every human being walks this earth with that potential folded inside them like an unopened letter. But most never read it. Most never unfold what's waiting. Not because they don't want to, but because they never learned how. The gap between who you are today and who you could become isn't filled by chance, it's filled by choice. And that choice begins with education. Not the formal kind alone, but the kind that shapes your soul, sharpens your vision, and strengthens your spirit. That kind of education is the bridge. You don't just wake up one day and become the person you're meant to be. You grow into that person through learning, through unlearning, through effort, and through awareness. And this kind of learning doesn't happen by accident. It requires intention. It requires you to pick up the tools of growth and build the bridge step by step, one realization at a time, one book, one conversation, one moment of clarity, one moment of humility where you admit you don't know yet, but you're willing to find out. That's how transformation begins. People often wait for change to arrive like a delivery, but transformation doesn't come knocking. It doesn't fall into your lap. It's something you build on the inside. And you build it by feeding your mind with the kind of truths that wake you up. You study yourself, you study others. You seek out new models, new frameworks, new perspectives. You observe your thoughts. You question your conditioning. You explore your beliefs. And slowly the scaffolding of the bridge appears. With every insight, you move closer. With every challenge faced and integrated, you become lighter. You carry less baggage, less fear, fewer illusions, and that makes room for something greater. You don't just become wiser by aging. Time doesn't educate you. What you do with time does. You can be older and still be stuck in the same patterns if you never look inward, if you never explored what's behind your behaviors, if you never studied what causes your suffering or drives your decisions. Education is how you stop repeating the same chapter and start writing a new one. It gives you language for your emotions, clarity about your direction, and insight into your purpose. Without it, you're wandering. With it, you're evolving. The person you could be isn't waiting in some distant future. They are waiting behind your next choice to learn, behind your next moment of courage, behind your next willingness to say, I don't know, but I want to understand. This isn't about perfection. It's about movement. Movement from unconsciousness to awareness, from automatic to intentional, from surface to depth. And that movement is powered by education. You cannot become who you are meant to be while clinging to what you've always believed. Growth demands expansion, and expansion demands education. When you invest in your learning, you're not just gathering information, you're sculpting your life. You're literally building the mental, emotional, and spiritual muscles required to carry the weight of your higher self. Because becoming that future version of yourself isn't just about dreaming, it's about preparing. That version of you has responsibilities, clarity, peace, presence, and power. And you don't rise into that version by wishing. You rise by working, by reading, by asking, by reflecting, by changing, by choosing growth over comfort, by choosing honesty over ego. There is no fast lane to this. There's no shortcut. You walk the bridge one step at a time. And every step you take in learning more about the world, about others, about yourself, you are walking into your own becoming. It's quiet work, often invisible to the world, but it shows up in how you speak, how you listen, how you respond, how you lead. And over time, that education reshapes not just what you know, but who you are. Most people remain strangers to their potential because they never took the time to study what was possible. They looked outward for answers, for approval, for shortcuts, but they forgot to look inward. They forgot to ask, who could I become if I committed to learning deeply, intentionally, and consistently? That question alone changes the direction of a life. Because when you start to learn who you are beyond the roles you play, beyond the noise of the world, beyond the story you were handed, you begin to meet the real you, the limitless you, the powerful you, the you who's been waiting on the other side of that bridge. Education is not just a phase of life, it is life. It's not confined to classrooms, certifications, or structured lessons. It is woven into every moment we breathe, every experience we endure, and every insight we uncover. When we truly understand this, we stop seeing education as a destination and begin embracing it as a way of being. We begin to realize that every struggle is a syllabus, every success a lesson, and every interaction a chance to grow. This journey begins the moment we understand that real learning starts where traditional schooling ends. It's when we listen to our curiosity more than our conditioning. It's when we choose to examine life instead of merely living it by default. True education frees us, not just from ignorance, but from the illusions we've outgrown. It is the path to self-mastery, to emotional depth, to intellectual clarity, and to spiritual grounding. The cost of ignorance is far too high, And the reward of wisdom is beyond measure. When we choose to nourish our minds with intentionality, just as we do our bodies, we build resilience, vision, and inner peace, and in doing so, we start becoming the people we were always meant to be. Every piece of knowledge we seek becomes a brick in the bridge that connects who we are to who we are capable of becoming. This is not about perfection or status, this is about transformation, because in the end, your greatest power will never come from what you've memorized, but from what you've realized. And education, true soul-shaping education, is what makes that realization possible